Thank you very much, Nathaniel. Well, we're going to be continuing our series in the book of Colossians, so you might want to turn to Colossians chapter 3. And in a moment, Nicola is going to come and read for us, but I just want to say something about that first. So Colossians chapter 3 from verse 22, it's on page 1184 in the Red Church Bibles. And just to say that this passage is about slaves. And depending on your translation, the first word of verse 22 might be slaves, or if you have an ESV, it might be bondservants, although the footnote says slaves. And that's because this one Greek word has a number of different translations. It could be slave, it could be bondservant. And in fact, if you look down to chapter 4, verse 7, which we'll come to in a week or two, the same root word is translated servant. So you have slave, bondservant, and servant or minister. And you might think, well, that's a bit confusing. But actually, I suppose it's a bit like the word home. So my home is in Swindon Terrace, and the king's home is in Buckingham Palace. And birds have a home, their nest in Heaton Park. Same word, different homes. And this word can mean a few different things. It can mean slave, or bondservant, or servant. And so in the ancient world, yes, some people were bought and sold. They were slaves all their lives. But some were bond servants. That is, they were bonded. They were tied to their master for a limited period of time. And some of those could own property. Some of those were tutors or civil servants. And so what we're talking about today is really very much like employment. And so when you hear the word slave, our problem is that we only think about slavery in the deep south of America or the terrible heritage that Britain had of capturing people from Africa and bringing them to work in sugar plantations or cotton picking. And so yes, some slaves in the first century were like that, but actually it's a much wider thing. It's very similar in some ways to employment for us. So what we're going to be looking at this morning is about work. It is about slaves and masters, but work, paid or unpaid, and how you go to work on a Monday morning. But Nicola is going to read for us from chapter 3, verse 22 to chapter 4, verse 1. Thanks.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it, not only when their eyes is on you, not only when and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there will be no favoritism. Masters, provide for your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know you also have a master in heaven.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nicola. Most of us, I suspect, spend most of our waking lives at work. Jerome K. Jerome said, "I like work." It's going to come up on the PowerPoint at some point. Not that one. Anyway, Jerome K. Jerome said, "I like work. It fascinates me. I can stand and watch it for hours." And he went on, he says, "I can't just sit still and see another man slaving. I want to get up. It's in my energetic nature, I suppose. I just can't help it. I want to walk around with my hands in my pockets and superintend and tell him what to do." That is, we all work, paid or unpaid. Many of us spend most of our waking lives at work, whether that's writing emails or hoovering, in the surgery or changing nappies. And Colossians 3 is all about work. Now, of course, we can't really start from verse 22, can we? We really need to start from Colossians 1, because we've seen this before, that all this stuff here flows from all that stuff there. Sorry, we're not at that PowerPoint yet either. Only take all the exciting stuff away. Verse 22, it doesn't start here. It starts back at chapter 1, verse 1. In other words, the second half of Colossians builds on the first half of Colossians. And all through Colossians, Paul has been saying, you are in Christ. You are united to Christ. So, from chapter 3, be who you are. Wear the clothes that Christ would wear. You're in Jesus. Act like you're in Jesus. Put off these filthy clothes. Put on these good ones. Put on Christ. You're in him, so be like him. And we saw 2 weeks ago that was how we were to live in a church family. And we saw last week that what matters is how you put on the right clothes in your home as husbands and wives. And today Paul says that this matters for slaves and masters, for workers and bosses, because how you work matters and how you go to work matters. And whether that's paid or unpaid, most of us spend most of our waking lives working, and that matters to Jesus. We work a lot, and that matters to Jesus. And there is a lot of work to do. There are emails, or there's cooking and hoovering. There's stuff in the office, there's stuff at home, there's caring for patients or caring for small children, and that matters to Jesus. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, what Jesus is saying is, you work for me. Sure, it looks like you work for the NHS. It looks like you work for Newcastle City Council. It looks like you work for Christchurch. It looks like you work in the home. And you do, but you don't, because ultimately, you work for me, paid or unpaid. So how you work matters. And Paul gives quite a bit of space to slaves and masters. And many people in this church at this time were slaves. But you might be thinking, what about the elephant in the room? Slavery. I mean, slavery's bad, no? Why doesn't Paul just abolish slavery? And the short answer to that is there is no short answer to that. But let me try. And it's this. You can't always change the world, but you can live to please Jesus wherever he's placed you. In the Roman Empire at that time, perhaps half the population were slaves. And to imagine a world in those days without slavery would be like imagining ours without electricity. And in a different letter, Paul says to slaves, if you can get your freedom, get it. But that is not his priority. That is not his big priority. He's got a bigger purpose, and it's this on the screen. You can't always change the world, but you can always live to please Jesus wherever he's placed you, no matter how evil the days are. So that, you see, if a downtrodden slave 2,000 years ago can live to please God, then you and I can too in 2023. And they had to live for him in their culture, and we have to live for him in our culture. Because whether you're a slave or a managing director, you and I need to figure out how to live for him in the days that he gives us to live. And that will always take guts. And so Paul gives principles here that have to be worked out in every age, in every culture, for everyone. Because you can't always change the world, but you can live to please God wherever he's placed you. And of course, what the gospel does, what Paul does, even in Colossians, is he lays the seeds of the abolition of slavery. Even back up in verse 11, Paul says that in Jesus there are no divisions at all. There is no slave or free. There are no little people. Everyone is equal in Jesus. And so the seeds for the overthrow of slavery are there in the gospel. And we know, of course, that over the centuries, ungodly men twisted the Bible to justify slavery. But that's what ungodly people will always do. Ungodly people always twist stuff to say anything they want to twist stuff. And just because they twisted the Bible doesn't mean the Bible is twisted. And gospel-hearted people knew that the gospel overthrows slavery. And it did. And slavery was abolished. And I'd love to say that there's no such thing as slavery today, but you know that there is. People are still literally bought and sold into the sex industry or into forced labor. Our global economy has created economic slaves where people work in factories in Bangladesh or China or Mexico in awful conditions for meager pay. And the thing is that you and I don't quite face those conditions in Newcastle, but working life here is not a piece of cake, is it? You and I may not be owned by our boss, but sometimes it feels like it, especially when they email late at night and they expect a response. Or you may be on a 0 hours contract and you don't know, will I get work tomorrow? You've got no security. Or perhaps you're trapped in a job with an unreasonable work culture and boss. And you can't choose better working conditions. And you can't just quit because there are no alternatives out there, or the alternatives that there are just as bad. And you see, like Paul, like slaves in Paul's days, you and I can't always change the world, but we do need to figure out how can we live for Jesus in the days that he's given us. What does it look like tomorrow morning when the alarm goes off on Monday morning? What does it look like? Well, I think first, verse 22, it looks like that you and I work under authority. We work under authority. Verse 22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. Who does Paul write to, by the way? Paul writes to slaves. No one in the ancient world wrote to slaves. Slaves, sure, management consultants wrote to masters. They never wrote to slaves. They thought slaves were like machines on legs, or like animals that worked on instinct. So if you were a farmer, you don't reason with your cows, do you? You don't have a conversation with your tractor. In the same way, you don't reason with slaves. But Paul writes to slaves and treats them as human beings. He gives them dignity. And he says, look, here's something to do. Here's something not to do. Why? Well, because you're made in God's image. You're a human being and you can make choices. And there are no little people. And that was revolutionary. And the gospel gives the basis for human rights. It's stuff we take for granted today, but it wasn't there before, and it's not there in every culture. But Paul starts with the word slaves, and he says, obey your earthly masters in everything. In other words, when the boss tells you to do something, you've got a choice. Do it or not. And Paul says, do it. You work under their authority. And of course, that's how our world works. There's always someone over you and there's someone over them, and you have to obey them or else there's anarchy. Even Jesus is under authority. He's not inferior to his Father, but he submits to his Father. Because order is woven into the universe that God has made. And elsewhere, Paul says, obey the government that's put over you. And when Paul wrote obey the government, in those days, the government was Caesar Nero, and Nero was the guy who used to throw Christians to the lions or turn Christians into human torches. But this is just simply how God has made the world. Obey your boss, obey the government, obey authority, not necessarily because they're good people, not because they're right all the time, but because God is a God of order. And really our country or our work, our church family, our homes, they need structure. And in God's kindness, he gives structure, not anarchy. So we're to obey. Now we're going to see in a moment that when Paul says obey your earthly masters in everything, that does not mean obey your boss when he says to cheat the tax man. It's not obey when he says to cheat a customer or to cut corners in your bricklaying. Why? We're going to see this because you work for Jesus first. And because you work for Jesus first, that might lead you to disobey your boss. And that might lead you to a beating or to getting fired. But apart from that, in everything, verse 22, obey your earthly masters in everything. And just notice in passing, it is your earthly masters. That is, yes, we are all people under authority. We have earthly masters. Some of them are a pain in the neck. Some of them are harsh. But they're earthly. They are temporary. They have limited authority over you while you're on this earth. That is, your boss won't be your boss forever. But Jesus will be. And that leads us to the second point, that you work for the Lord. You work for the Lord. All through these verses, we see that you work for the Lord. So verse 22, we work out of reverence for the Lord. Verse 23, work with all your heart as working for the Lord. Or the end of verse 24, it is the Lord Christ that you're serving. Could that be any more clear? Jesus is your true master, not the dragon who sits in the corner office. And you go to work tomorrow and it looks like you're working for them, but you're not. You're working for Jesus. And on the screen you'll see a quote from William Tyndale, because 500 years ago the reformers discovered, or they rediscovered, this truth. That if you look externally, they said, the screen before. If you look externally, there is a difference between washing dishes and preaching the word. But as to touching the Lord, to please God, none at all. In other words, washing dishes and preaching, they look different from the outside, but one is not more godly than the other, because whatever you do for him. And the key is that if God would have you washing dishes or changing a nappy today, then what the heck are you doing preaching? If God would have you doing one thing and you're doing another, then who are you doing that for? You're probably doing it for yourself. But you can do anything. You can work for him, and anything you do, you can do for him. So do it for him. Because anything is made beautiful in his eyes. In the 1800s, Spurgeon, he had a maid who worked in his home, and she became a Christian. And he turned to her and said, "What difference has it made to you, having become a Christian?" And she answered, "Well, sir, I now sweep under your rugs as well." And if you like, Jesus is saying, you work for me, and do all you do for him, because in his hands it becomes beautiful and precious. And in his hands, your work is an act of worship. And there's no such thing as secular work. Because that email, that assignment, the way you treat your patient or your customer or your children or your grandchildren, the dishes you washed, anything you do can be done as an act of worship. There's a kind of alchemy that goes on, that anything you do is turned to gold in his eyes. Because anything can be made beautiful if it's done for him. And so your work is an act of worship. It's something that's a way of pleasing God, of honoring God. And he made you uniquely, so you work the way you work for him. And work is one of God's great gifts for us. When Paul was writing this, in the days of the Roman gods and the Greek gods, they sat on Mount Olympus having a party. And they hated work. They thought work was a curse, so they gave work as a curse to human beings. But the Bible says no. Work is a gift from God. It's a way to image God. It's a way to be like God. Because God himself works in creation. He works for 6 days and then he rests. And Adam and Eve are given work before the fall, before there's any sin. And God made us with a massive capacity for work 6 days out of 7. And Jesus says in John 5, he says, "My Father is working and I too am working," present tense. And of course, in the new creation for all eternity, we will serve him, we will work with him, for him, and it'll be work without frustration and tears and toil. And so, work now, work then is a way to worship God. It's a way to glorify him and enjoy him forever. And work is a very good thing, and in his eyes it can be a beautiful thing. But all work now is messed up by sin. All work is messed by the fall. And you may go into work this week with a very heavy heart. You may feel that your work is too big, or too futile, or too frustrating, or too stressful, too boring, too unnoticed, too unthanked, perhaps unpaid. Your work may not be what you always wanted it to be. But you work for Jesus, and he sees, and nothing is wasted, and nothing is in vain. Because as you work for Jesus, paid or unpaid, what you're doing is you're pushing back the wilderness world of the fall by just an inch. And when you work for Jesus, it's a kind of alchemy, because work is an act of worship, and all things can be done for him, and he turns it into gold dust. So you work for me, says Jesus. And then he goes on, or Paul goes on, verse 22, work with all your heart. Look at verse 22. Slaves, obey your masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry favor. And let me pause there for a second. I'm guessing that in every single workplace there's somebody like that. Perhaps it's you, but I hope not. There's always someone who looks impressive when the boss is around, but as soon as their back is turned, they're just back on their phones and they're kind of backbiting about the boss. You know, when the boss is there, they're eager to please, eager to curry favor. As soon as they're gone, that work evaporates. Well, let that not be you, says Paul. Why? Because you work for Jesus. So then how should you work? Verse 23. Verse 23, whatever you do, work at it complainingly as for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it shoddily as for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it bitterly or half-heartedly or carelessly as for the Lord. You know, do any of those words describe Jesus? Obviously not. You can't put those clothes on Jesus. Don't put them on you. So Paul says, verse 23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. You work for him, so work from the heart. Or in verse 20, at the end of verse 22, he says, with sincerity of heart. And that word sincerity was a word that was used of cloth that had been unfolded in the marketplace. You know, you're going to buy a cloth, a tablecloth or something. It was unfolded so that you could see that there were no marks or stains. You could hold it up into the light. You could see that what you see is what you get. And therefore, a sincere heart implies integrity. You're one person. You're the same person no matter who's watching. And people who only work when the boss's eye is on them, or who are people pleasers, or who act as if the sun shines out of their boss's backside, the people like that are actors. They're hypocrites, but not so with you. Have a sincere heart. Have an integral heart. Be uncomplicated, unfolded, not two-sided, one-sided, one-faced. Be the same no matter who's looking at you. Whether Jesus is looking, or your peers are looking, or your boss is looking. And how can you be like that? You can be like that when you realize that Jesus knows you inside out. He's seen inside every fold. He's seen the hidden corners, and yet he still wants you. That is, he died for you in the cross when he saw the worst about you. When he saw all the dirt hidden in those folds. He died for you when you were a scrumpled, filthy mess, and he made you his. So on Monday morning, you don't have to pretend. You can be the same person no matter who's watching, because there's only one person whose opinion matters. There's only one person you need to please, and he's already delighted in you. So don't pretend, either in front of Jesus, which is stupid, or don't pretend in front of your boss. Don't pretend in front of other people, because you've nothing to hide, nothing to fear. And then you'll not be afraid that someone might discover something. So, verse 23, do all you do with all your heart, as for the Lord. And that's a powerful witness. Later in Titus, Paul says this. He says, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God our Savior attractive. In other words, when you work from the heart, that makes the gospel attractive. The ESV says it adorns the gospel. It's like beautiful jewelry or the aroma of home baking, that when you work for the Lord, it makes Jesus attractive, and because being like him is attractive. By contrast, when I worked as an accountant many years ago, I absolutely stank. I wanted to talk about Jesus, but I did not work heartily for my firm. I thought my 9 to 5 was all going to get burned up. I thought it was a waste of time. I thought the only thing that mattered was spiritual stuff, church stuff. I did not work for the Lord with sincerity of heart. I did not understand the stuff that I'm just saying, and I did not make Jesus beautiful to my colleagues by the way that I worked. And the thing is that you are called to work for your boss and for Jesus, and you are a witness for Jesus, either a bad one like I was, or someone who adorns the gospel, makes it attractive, makes Jesus attractive. C.S. Lewis says, imagine if the best plumber, the best writer, the best doctor, the best teachers, the best painters, imagine if they were Christians. What would that say to the world about who God is? About a God who is worth working for. About a God who notices how you spend your week and really cares. Who cares so much about you that he's invested in everything that you do. You see, so paid or unpaid, work from the heart because you work for Jesus. And your work is an act of worship. And that makes taking out the rubbish or answering yet another customer complaint or yet another spreadsheet, it makes those gold dust in God's eyes. But just to add a footnote at this point, that this is not about workaholism, and I'm not talking about perfectionism. Luther has this great example of a man trying to get on the horse, but unfortunately the man is drunk, and so the man falls off one side of the horse, and so to compensate, he overbalances and falls off the other side of the horse. And just because we shouldn't be lazy at work, we shouldn't fall off the horse the other side and become workaholics. Yes, work is an act of worship, but we are not to worship work. That is, you can work hard and then lay it down and stop and rest. And even in creation, there is a rhythm of work and then rest. And many of us, I think, need to learn how to rest better in God rather than to try to be God. But work is an act of worship. We are not to worship God, but we are to work from our hearts. And the last thing that Paul says to slaves in verse 24 is that we work for his reward. Verse 24, you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. And that would have been a very precious verse to any slave. Because if you were a slave, you were owned, body and soul. And you never owned anything. You didn't own any personal property. You wouldn't have inherited. But Paul says your true master Jesus will reward you. He sees, he knows, and he has an inheritance for you. And I think that is so precious for many of us today. Because you may be working with young children or with grandchildren. You may be retired. You may be working in the home. And sometimes you don't get a salary. And the problem in our world is that we only value stuff that's got a salary. We only value work that we can put a pound sign on. But the thing is, you work for Jesus and he will reward you. Or you may work in a job where, honestly, you're underpaid and you're paid less than someone else doing the same job, but he sees and he will reward you. Or you may work hard in a job and you've been overlooked. You've not been recognized. You've never had the recognition, the opportunities that you wished you'd had in life. But you work for the Lord and he will reward you. So work for him. Work for his well done, good and faithful servant, for your inheritance in Jesus, because that is worth more than any salary. Now, there's nothing wrong with negotiating a pay rise. That is, people should be paid fairly for work that they do, and if you can resolve it, do it. If you need to change your job, you can change your job. These verses are not about being a doormat. But the principle here is that whether you're paid peanuts or you're paid millions, what matters in 10,000 years is the inheritance that Jesus has for you. And verse 24 is an encouragement that God sees, God knows, and God will reward you. But if verse 24 is an encouragement, verse 25 is a warning. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. You know, if my boss treats me badly or messes me around, can I mess them around? If management treats me badly, can I be lazy or shoddy? No. Why? Because God is still God. And their sin doesn't give you a right to be sinful. Or if my boss asks me to do something wrong, can I do that? No. Why? Because God is still God. And their sin doesn't give you an excuse to be sinful. Through world history, many awful things have been done by people saying, I'm just following orders. But no, their sin does not give you an excuse to be sinful. So yes, verse 22, obey your earthly masters in everything, but remember you serve me first, says Jesus. And you can't obey your earthly master when they tell you to disobey your heavenly master. And that might be very costly for you. But you work for Jesus, for an eternity with Jesus. And he will reward you. You will never miss out if you work for his well done. So that's how to go to work tomorrow morning. Obey your earthly masters, but first obey the Lord. Work heartily for him, because all your work can be an act of worship. But one more brief thing to notice before I close, and that is, yes, all of us are under authority, but some of us also have authority. In other words, we're not just employees, we may also be employers. And in chapter 4, verse 1, Paul addresses masters. He says, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair. The ESV says what is just and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. In a previous life, I used to be in airports quite a lot. And one of the things I love in airports is going into a bookshop and browsing the shelves on management. Don't know if you've done that. I have to tell you that self-help, pop psychology, trashy management books are the best. You have to get some of those. And 2,000 years ago, management books would have been addressed to masters, but there would have been nothing in them about how to treat slaves. They would never have given slaves a second thought. So here's one on the PowerPoint. Aristotle, in his Ethics, he says there is no point talking about being just in your treatment of slaves because the master owns the slave. So the concept of justice is irrelevant. You know, if I own a table and chairs, I can do what I like with them. They're mine. I can break them up. I can burn them as firewood. They're mine. The concept of justice doesn't apply to a table and chairs. So too with slaves. But the gospel undermines that, and Paul can address masters and tell them how to treat their employees, their slaves. Because again, Paul treats slaves as human beings. He honors slaves, and so he says to masters, treat them justly and fairly. And that was revolutionary. Only the gospel gives the basis for human rights, for employment rights, for stuff we take for granted today that wasn't there thousands of years ago, and that isn't there in some cultures. Because the gospel gives profound dignity to every person and says, treat even the lowest justly and fairly. And justice is about the letter of the law, fairness is about the spirit of the law, and to treat everybody justly or fairly and rightly is both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So this week, if you have people under you, how do you care about them? Do you care about them? Or do you just dump on them? Do you treat people with dignity? Do you pay your employees, your staff fairly, promptly? Perhaps you think that's the HR department. It's not your problem. But do you expect them to do overtime whenever it suits you or catch up on work over the weekend? In other words, do you treat them as Jesus treats you? Because once again, notice the end of verse 1, you have a master in heaven. You work for him, so work like him. And think about it, how does Jesus treat you? Does he ever treat you harshly? Jesus is the best master you could have, so model him to those under you. Treat others under your authority the same way that Jesus would treat you. Treat them justly and fairly, and that too will adorn the gospel. Make it beautiful and desirable. So that's how to go to work on Monday morning. Paid or unpaid, do all you do as an act of worship because you work for Jesus. And just one quick thought really as I close. God nowhere in the Bible treats you as a slave. Even in the book of Exodus that we were studying earlier this year, God takes slaves and makes them children because God never has slaves. He doesn't even have employees. He only has children. And the Father adopts you into his family as his beloved daughter or son. He adopts you in the Son. And that changes everything. And Jesus said, my Father is working and I am working, because the Son of God works, because sons in the Bible worked in the ancient world, but sons worked with their fathers. Sons worked with their fathers because they were invested in the work. They had a stake in the work. They were involved in it. And we too, as the Father's children, work with him. And the key is that we don't work to earn from him. We work to enjoy him. And that's coming up on the PowerPoint too. We don't work to earn from Jesus. We work to enjoy Jesus because we work with Jesus. You don't work to earn your place in heaven. You already have everything in Jesus, all his riches. You will inherit everything, and so you can go to work with a light heart because you have everything in him. We don't work to earn from him. We work to enjoy him because we work with him. So whatever you do this week, paid or unpaid, do all you do as an act of worship, working with him for his well done, good and faithful servant. Let's pray. Father, what an incredible privilege we have to do all we do in your presence and for your glory. And what an incredible honor to see small stuff, big stuff, everything we do, that you care. And that there are no little tasks and there are no little people. And that we can do all we do for your well done. And thank you too that we never do anything alone. We only ever do all we do in Jesus. That we work with him and for him, now and forever. And so we pray, may our days be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, as we close, we're